Lord of Mysteries. Fire of Destruction Chapter 31 to 40. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Thursday arrived and Adrian was arriving at the club. What Adrian has been doing these days has not been much. He attended his classes with Isengar, and he was chatting a lot with Robert every time he went to the club. Now was the day that the curious group of friends came back, and if the redhead was honest, he missed talking to them. Arriving at the club, Adrian could see that Robert was dressed more elegantly than usual, and this time he was not reading, which surprised Adrian quite a bit. Approaching Robert, he greeted him happily and mentioned that everyone was upstairs waiting for Isaac to give the message and the reason for this meeting. Going up to the floor, the redhead managed to see how it was much more crowded than normal. There were a lot more people than he expected, and the atmosphere was quite cheerful. Waiters walked down the aisle with a tray full of drinks, handing them out to the members. Taking a glass from the tray, Adrian took a sip of the drink. A somewhat bittersweet wine, 7.5-10 feet. Adrian took advantage and headed towards a random group to kill time while they waited for the advice from Isaac. After half an hour, Isaac, Victor, and Charles finally showed up, and Isaac went to the front clapping to get the attention of the members. Good afternoon everyone, and I am sorry I've been gone for so long. But putting that aside, we have good news. On June 30th there will be a big party organized for the hunting clubs. Everyone is invited to attend, as this party is to increase relations between the clubs and to organize a huge hunting at the end of the year. This caused all the club members to raise their drinks and applaud the good news. Adrian also applauded the news with a fake smile. End of the year, keeping his dark thoughts, Adrian just came to his friends and started talking with them. After a few hours of partying, Adrian, after greeting the group, said goodbye and went home to wait for tomorrow. Ads by PubFuture. Finally, Friday had arrived and Mr. A's party was just around the corner. Adrian was at Braveheart's bar right now and was sitting at a table waiting for the agreed time with Zio. 2 p.m. has arrived and Adrian could see the so distinctive Zio arrived, but she was not alone but was accompanied by another woman. She was about 1.65 meters in height. She has slightly curly brown hair and pale blue eyes. Looking at the woman, Adrian recognized her easily and couldn't help but smile as he gave out a small laugh. Welcome, Miss Magician. Zio looked around and was able to easily spot the man's striking red hair. Seeing that he had been discovered, Adrian raised his glass of beer and signaled for him to come closer. Heaving a sigh of relief, Zio approached the table while Furs followed her while looking around extremely uncomfortable because of the looks she was receiving. Sitting across from the redhead, both women looked at this man. Zio looked at him calmly while Furs looked at him with a glimmer of hope. I'm sorry, Miss Magician, but what I'm going to tell you is not going to please you at all, thought with shame the redhead. Acting as if he didn't know Furs, Adrian glanced at Zio with a raised eyebrow showing his doubt. Observing the redhead's reaction, Zio remained calm. She's a friend I always go to the party with, and we will leave for the party in 20 minutes. Did you bring what you needed to cover yourself? Smiling at Zio, Adrian took out his jacket and mask and showed them to them. Nodding to that, they remained in a somewhat uncomfortable silence, but it always seemed that Furs wanted to speak. Every time she was about to speak, Zio would prick her leg and stop her. Ads by PubFuture. Adrian observed all this with a slight smile and calmly sipped his drink. They were like that until it was time to leave for the party. Inside the party, being covered by his mask and coat, Adrian could already tell the big difference between Mr. A's party and Isengar's. The number of workers and the signs hanging on the walls and the possibility of private exchanges were like night and day. No doubt Mr. A was very serious about creating his connections and talking about Mr. A. Looking up at a raised podium, Adrian could see said man. He was wearing a hooded robe, hiding his looks under a shadow. Without a doubt, the strength of a sequence 5 Beyander was surprising, and his aura was really something else. The redhead knew for sure that no one below the demigod would be able to stand up to Mr. A. No one dared to provoke the powerful man for fear of being killed. The three of them were sitting and waiting for the party to start. Adrian was somewhat anxious as he would finally be able to get the materials for the provocateur, potion, and in Adrian's personal opinion, this sequence would be one of the easiest to perform. The redhead was confident that he could digest the potion before Joe woke up, that should be around half of July. His next problem would be to get the formula for pyromaniac, but that would be for the future. While Adrian was in his world, Furs took advantage and glanced at him from time to time. This is supposed to be the man who had information about his problem and a possible solution. The fact of attending this party was also to see if she could get the next formula for her sequence, but that was now her last concern. She was only thinking about the end of the party so she could hear all the information this man had. She just prayed that he had a way to save her from this nightmare. The party starts. Before the deep voice of Mr. A, many workers began to move between the tables to collect the orders of the participants. Adrian quickly wrote his request on a note and placed it on the tray of one of the workers, who quickly took it away. As Adrian waited to see if anyone had what he needed, he began to look around. Multiple people did the same as him, while others were taken to private rooms to discuss deals. He could see Mr. A, who was sitting at the podium while supervising everything. One couldn't deny that Mr. A could certainly keep this place quiet and keep the troublemakers away. In that, a worker approached him and told him that someone was interested in selling him what he needed. Saying goodbye to the two ladies, Adrian followed the worker to one of the private rooms, all of this under the watchful eye of Mr. A. Upon arriving in the room, the worker opened the door, allowing him to enter. Inside, one could see a person covered by a cloak sitting in an armchair in front of a small table. Adrian didn't care about their identity and simply sat in front of her. "You have a horned toad's tongue and the lungs of a provocative rooster. 300 pounds for each." The person's voice seemed like that of an old man. Adrian stared at the now identified man in front of him. "I don't have all day, boy. If you don't have the money, get out." Adrian could only resign himself to this price and took out the 600 pounds. Handing them over to the man, he simply grabbed them, gave them a slight glance, and stuffed them into his cloak. Then he took out two simple containers from his bag, one medium and one small, which were sealed by a wall of spirituality, then placed them on the table in front of him and then stared at the ceiling. Adrian grabbed the containers and checked the contents inside them, starting with the small one. Destroying the wall of spirituality, the redhead opened the container and managed to see what looked like the long tongue of a toad that seemed slightly covered in poison. Feeling very little attraction to this, Adrian was able to confirm his legitimacy. Closing the small one and reapplying the wall of spirituality, Adrian tucks it into one of the many pockets inside his cloak. Now grabbing the medium container and undoing the wall of spirituality, he could see red lungs. Feeling the same small attraction to it, Adrian closed the container and stuffed it into his cloak. As he was getting up to leave, the man stopped him. "Listen, kid, I have an offer you can't refuse." Ads by PubFuture. "I'm not interested, old man, our deal ends here." Ignoring and interrupting the man, Adrian simply headed for the door. The man didn't care about the insult and just said one thing. 12 feathers of the provocative rooster. This made Adrian stop in mid-grab for the door handle. A tense silence enveloped the two men. "How much?" It was the only thing the redhead said. "As I said before, a unique offer of 7 pounds for every 6 feathers. Deal." Giving the 14 pounds to the man, Adrian now had in his hands some feathers whose tip was red but the rest was black, very ugly. "I hope I never have to see you again, old man." Saying that and keeping these feathers, Adrian quickly left the room before the man's eyes. He simply got up from his chair and knelt on the floor and began to pray quietly. "The Lord that created everything. The Lord who reigns behind the curtain of shadows. The degenerate nature of all living things. There is nothing special about the boy. You ordered me to investigate." Having said all that, the man fell silent as if he were listening to an answer. "What you say, my lord?" Saying that, the man dissolved into shadows and left the room as if no one had ever been there. As Adrian went to his table, he couldn't help but touch where he kept the containers and feathers. With all this, he already had everything, the poison of the horned toad he had bought from a pharmacy. Ads by PubFuture. Surprisingly, the poison was widely used to make ointments for ladies' skin and its sale was not illegal. The only illegal thing was to sell it in large quantities, but buying a few drops was not a problem. The problem had come with the feathers of the provocative rooster. To say it without being too insulting, these were not only useless but also extremely ugly, so no mentally healthy person would sell them. It was a bit of great luck that this man also sold those feathers, but Adrian was not at all happy about it. It was a huge coincidence that he knew exactly what he needed and the redhead didn't know if he had been discovered by the paranoid, and this was his way of investing in him. Sensing his weakness once more, Adrian knew that the only way to fix this would be to get stronger, so resigning himself he could simply lower his head. When he was stronger, no one could control him. And so he arrived at the table that he shared with Zio and Furs, and they were still sitting. It seemed that they had no luck finding what they wanted. When he sat down at the table, Zio gave him a look and, seeing his mood, he couldn't help but ask. Did you find what you were looking for? I found too much. After saying that, he didn't say any more, which caused a vein to pop out on Zio's forehead and Furs just let out a small laugh. This only made Zio stomp on her foot to make her shut up. ... After an hour Mr. A had ended the party and this caused Furs and Zio's hearts to contract. The moment they were waiting for all these days had arrived. Standing in an alley far from the place where the party was held, Zio and Furs, now without their masks and coats, were standing in front of Adrian, who, just like them, had taken off his disguise. I fulfilled our agreement. If you want to attend the party again, it is held every Friday at 4 p.m. so now it's your turn. Zio's gaze was quite strong. Tell us everything you know about the ravings of the blood moon. At this, the redhead gave a smile. Adrian's smile made Zio and Furs nervous, and even Furs discreetly grabbed one of the marbles from her bracelet. Well, are you going to tell us or what? That's what I was going to miss, Zio. I just hope you don't regret this. The ravings of the blood moon are very old and started in the 4th epoch. They mainly affected an angel family of that time. This causes all its high-ranking members to fall one by one until all the members of this family cannot go beyond sequence 7 because they would either lose control or die. The more the redhead talked, the more fear filled Fur's heart. She was sure that she was not a member of this family, and all this started when she activated that damn bracelet. A cold sweat ran down her back as she looked down at her wrist and saw her bracelet. This curse only affects that family and the Beyonders of the apprentice path if they use some extraordinary item related to the family. All this information was far greater than what Furs came to get, and it was overwhelming her. But little did Zio care about all this, and she stopped Adrian in the middle of his explanation. Tell us a way to fix this curse. At Zio's words, the redhead could only sigh heavily and turn to look at Furs. You're not a family member, are you? Seeing this, Furs was quite surprised as Zio drew her triangle sword again. The redhead didn't care about the women's reaction to him, and he sighed again. There are in total 3 known ways to avoid the curse of ravings. Tell us now. Turning his gaze to Zio, the redhead gave a small smile. The first is to pray to a god and that he protects you from ravings, it doesn't matter which one. Furs' heart was filled with more and more fear. She had tried to pray to the god of steam and machinery, but she never received an answer. She even tried to pray to Evernight gods, god of knowledge and wisdom, lord of storm. But no one responded. Looking at the state of her friend, Zio simply urged Adrian to keep talking. The second way is for your friend to become a demigod. This already caused Furs to lean against the alley wall because her legs gave out and she couldn't stand up. Tears began to fall slowly from her eyes and she began to sob without caring that she was like this in front of a stranger. There was no hope for her and she was going to die no matter what she did. Ads by PubFuture. Seeing her friend Zio, she quickly grabbed Adrian by the collar of his shirt and slammed him against the wall. Adrian let this happen and simply looked at Zio's enraged face. Is this fun for you or what, you son of a bitch? At this, the redhead smiled again, but this time was sharper, and this caused Zio to barely contain herself to avoid stabbing this bastard. The third way is to resist until October. At this, Zio looked at the redhead as if another head had grown. Furs stopped sobbing for a moment and looked at the man that Zio had against the wall. What do you mean resist until October? At the question, Adrian rolled his reddish-brown eyes and looked at Furs, who was looking at him. I mean that literally. Resist until mid-October, because that will be the time that you will see a light of hope that will curl you up and help you with the curse. At those words, Zio slammed him against the wall again and stabbed the sword next to his head. How are you so sure of that, or do you think we are idiots? He was not at all intimidated by this move by Zio and even applauded this method. She is highly compatible with interrogator. While he was thinking this, Adrian spoke again. If I told you, you would die, or don't you know that, the more you know about something, the more infected you will be. At this Zio gritted her teeth and let go of the redhead, and he simply brushed off the dirt. Zio approached Furs and helped her up, and they headed out of the alley. But before leaving, Furs stopped Zio and turned to look at Adrian. You never said the family name. Adrian just smiled at her. Abraham. After saying this, Furs nodded and left with Zio. Seeing how the backs of the women left the alley, Adrian let go of his smile and could only sigh sadly. He could only hope that Furs could hold out until Joe arrived and could save her. He had no idea how his arrival had changed everything, if Furs supposedly never knew who were the Abraham until much later. Ads by PubFuture. Seeing that he was alone in the alley, Adrian only covered himself with the cloak and left the alley, heading home with somewhat heavy steps. It was time to move on to sequence 8. Dot 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 dot. Dot 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 dot. Dot 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 dot. Dot 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 dot. Once at home, Zio and Furs entered with a heavy step. Furs threw herself on the sofa and was face down, and Zio sat on the floor and leaned her back against the wall while her head was down looking at the floor. They stayed like that for a long time until Furs moved her head slightly and looked at Zio, who kept looking at the floor. Do you think he was telling the truth about mid-October? I don't know, but what other option do we have? Zio kept her head down looking at the floor, and Furs laid her head against the sofa again. Dot 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 dot. Dot dot dot. Dot 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 dot. Adrian right now was looking at the pot that had been rigorously cleaned again and the ingredients on the table. Right now he was going to prepare the potion to advance to sequence 8 feet provoker. Closing his eyes to meditate a bit to calm his heart. Opening his eyes, the redhead repeated the same process as when he prepared the hunter potion. Grabbing the vial with 80 milliliters of water, he poured it into the pot, then poured the 5 drops of liquor. Grabbing another vial, he poured the 7 grams of powdered iron, then took out the horrible feathers of the provocative rooster and threw them into the pot, and finally carefully grabbed the vial with the poison of the horned toad and poured 6 drops. This caused the feathers to dissolve and the liquid turned gray. Nodding to this, Adrian took the small container and opened it. Using a pair of tweezers, he grabbed the horned toad's tongue and dropped it into the liquid. This caused the gray liquid to begin to vibrate slightly. He quickly opened the medium-sized container and carefully took out the lungs of the provocative rooster. Dropping it into the pot, Adrian could see how the lung dissolved and the liquid stopped vibrating and turned dark reddish-brown. Nodding at this, Adrian poured the finished potion into a goblet, and as always there was no remnant left in the pot. The potion was ready. Holding the cup with the potion ready, Adrian was calm. The redhead gave a somewhat heavy sigh and raised the glass to his lips and began to drink. The potion went down much easier than the hunter potion did. It had a somewhat bitter taste and a texture like yogurt. Honestly, it tasted weird. When Adrian drank all the potion, nothing happened for a moment, but then his chest began to ache along with his throat. Entering a light meditative state, the redhead began to resist the effects brought by the potion. After a few minutes, Adrian opened his eyes and began to feel the changes brought by the potion. All of his physical abilities had been slightly increased, as well as his ability to make traps and analyze the environment. And he had gained 2 new abilities. The first was provocation, the main skill of the provoker. With enough understanding of a person, provokers can with just a few words provoke the enemy into losing their reason, whether it's a monster, beast, or a Beander that lost control and is incapable of communication. They can take the initiative to make them feel hate. The second was gaslighting. He can make people detest and hate themselves easily. It is also a form of provocation. Taking a closer look at his body after the promotion, Adrian realized that his lung capacity had increased considerably. If a provoker is dying, he at least has to have enough air to curse his killer, the redhead muttered to himself as he let out a long breath. Then he threw a strong fist towards the front, and feeling the force in it, he couldn't help but let out a little laugh. Also, my hand-to-hand combat skills have been increased. Of course, if you provoke someone, you have to be ready for their reaction. Although there is something strange, the potion has not been as digested as I expected. And that was true, the potion still lacked a 4/6 to be fully digested. Adrian had almost digested half, but he hoped that more than half was digested. But he did notice something, and it was that the compatibility he had with Provoker was quite high. This must be how Klein felt when he started acting as a faceless. Remembering Mr. Fool's experience, Adrian couldn't help but sigh again. Looking around, Adrian noticed that he could see colors more vividly. Sensing the excess of spirituality, Adrian meditated again to contain it. He then destroyed the wall of spirituality that he had made before making the potion and went to the bathroom to take a shower because he was covered in sweat again. Looking in the mirror, Adrian could see how his body had become slightly stronger, but he also noticed how his chest was bigger, showing the increase in his lungs. This made Adrian blush slightly. Even in his previous life, he had bigger pecs than normal, looking like breasts. They were even bigger than all the women he knew, and now Adrian also had quite big and strong pecs. The slightly big pink nipples didn't help. Blushing even more, Adrian left the bathroom and got dressed. He could only thank that no one could read his mind and see this embarrassing moment. Ads by PubFuture. Luckily his clothes still fit well, hiding his huge pecs. Slapping himself to keep from thinking about it, Adrian also put on the cloak and the modified mask, and he headed to East Borough. In another house located somewhat near the Bravehearts bar, one could see a small room inside which was a man sitting on the bed. Said man was 1.70 meters tall with black hair and seemed to be whispering something in a low voice. Opportunity to survive. Opportunity to survive. Opportunity to survive. After repeating that, the man quickly rested on the bed and began to dream. Within his dream he managed to see himself and a tall woman of 1.95 meters. She had orange blonde hair along with green eyes and a rather muscular body. The two of them were in some kind of boat in the middle of a black sea and a strong storm, and the boat was quickly falling apart. The two fell into the water and began to sink into the dark and cold depths of this sea. Suddenly his forearm and the woman's forearm were seized by strong hands and pulled out of the water. Looking at the one who pulled them out of the water, one could see his handsome face along with reddish-brown eyes and beautiful red hair. After seeing that, the dream broke and the man woke up extremely agitated. Allowing to see his blue eyes, and the man began to meditate to calm down. After all that, the man opened his blue eyes again and murmured something again. Mr. Chaplin. When he said that, someone knocked on the door of the room, and after the man allowed entry, a rather tall woman of 1.95 entered, the same woman from the dream. Seeing that he was being watched by the woman, the man could only sigh. We have to find Mr. Chaplin. While that was happening, in East Borough, something was happening that surprised those who lived in the area. And that was that everyone in the bar was looking in surprise at a man sitting on a man lying on the floor. And this man was covered by a mask, and the sack did not allow any of his features to be seen. Ads by PubFuture. On top of that, he seemed to care little about all the looks, and he kept talking. Come on guys, seriously, is that all? The Lord of Storm is ashamed to see such cowardly believers. This was obviously Adrian who was testing his new skills. Damn you. Slapping the bastard who was using it as a chair, Adrian took a sip from the glass of beer that was on the table. Then he spat in the face of another guy who was lying on the other side. What a shitty beer, do you really like this? The bartender would have been offended if it wasn't for the fact that he was so shocked seeing how only one man had beaten 6 men in less than 3 minutes. Spilling what was left of the beer on the face of the guy who was using it as a chair, Adrian got up and grabbed the guy's shirt and dragged him to a very fat man who was lying on his back with a swollen face. His left arm was bent in a weird angle and he let out groans of pain every breath he took. Then he kicked him to make him face the floor, then he pulled down his pants, showing everyone in the bar his dirty hairy ass. This made the guy he was dragging try to break free of his iron grip, giving him an idea of what was coming. Seeing that he couldn't get free, he simply yelled at Adrian. Crazy son of a bitch, you have any idea who we are? Slap. Adrian slapped him hard, leaving the man dazed and his cheeks marked with the imprint of his hand, then pulled him to his covered face and whispered into his ear. Yes, I know, and that's precisely why I'm doing it, so do me a favor and open your mouth wide. The man's eyes widened in horror and he opened his mouth to beg, but that was his worst mistake. Adrian immediately buried the bastard's face in his friend's dirty ass and held him there for a long time. The man tried with all his strength to free himself, but his strength paled to Adrian's strength. One could even hear the slightly muted screams through the ass that covered his face. The man stopped fighting with less and less force until he was completely still. Noticing that the man had passed out, Adrian finally released him. This made the man's face appear to everyone, and everyone saw how there was hair all over his face, hand marks on his cheeks, and brown spots on his face. Nodding to this, Adrian started to leave the bar, but one of the men he defeated earlier was standing in front of the entrance with a knife drawn. So on of a whore, SERR has the little est idea of whom you pro-oovoke. The man was barely standing and he could barely speak. He had a red band around his right arm just like the other 5. Smiling at the man even though the man couldn't see it, Adrian approached with confidence, making the man take a step back. Adrian walked out of the bar at a leisurely pace. A random man entered inside in hopes of getting drunk, but when he saw the interior he couldn't help but let out an exclamation of surprise. The redhead ignored that and continued walking, leaving East Borough. The beautiful red moon hung in the dark night sky, illuminating everything with its crimson light. After that, Adrian disappeared into the darkness of an alley. One could see a group with red bands on their right arms coming in with force. The one in the front was a man with a large, unkempt black beard and barely any hair on his head. He looked around and everyone his gaze fell on shrugged and looked at the ground. But little did he care about that reaction that he loved so much, since he only looked at how there were 5 of his men lying around the bar. Johnny. When he said that, the group behind him pushed the same man with the knife from before, but he was only wearing his underwear. The man was trembling and was looking at the floor, not returning his gaze. Tell me what happened here. Boss L, like I told you, a masked man entered the bar, and after seeing us he insulted us, and when we reacted he beat us to a pulp and make Tommy fall unconscious with Mark's ass. But the mentioned Johnny did not say a somewhat crucial detail, since he knew that if he told his boss it would throw him into the Tusok River to be food for the fish. Hearing that for the second time that night, the boss began to rub his brow due to the headache that all this caused him. Not only did they have some members who disappeared on a commission, but now a masked madman came and humiliated his gang like that. Now he would have to deal with the shame of this and with the humiliation that would come from the other gangs. Take the 5 idiots to rest and find out the identity of that madman. Said that the boss left the bar with a large vein pulsing on his forehead. Ads by PubFuture. Returning to Adrian, he was in his room after another shower and was feeling the progress of the potion. It was like how he suspected, even if it wasn't in large quantity, he could digest it at the end of the month. Maybe if he provoked Marich he could digest it in just a few sentences. Pushing those suicidal thoughts out of his head, Adrian began to plan his next act. Finding the members with red bands on their arms had been easier than he thought. After knocking out 5 and disarming the one that was left, Adrian managed to get some information out of him. The gang was called the Blood Mark and they were identified by the red bands on their right arms. And they were quite active around the southeast of East Borough. He couldn't get any more of the man because he refused to talk, and Adrian decided his punishment for that would be to run to his boss in only his underwear. Laughing at that, Adrian simply lay down to sleep. Tomorrow he had classes with Isengard and it was better that his brain was well rested. Hermes turned out to be fairly easy to learn, so it shouldn't be too long before he learned the language. But then there was Jotun, Elvish, Dragon and Ancient Hermes. Regretting that, Adrian simply slept to avoid thinking about it. This is how Saturday came. Adrian was already sitting in front of Isengard with a Hermes book in hand, paying attention to the class. And so 1500 arrived and the end of the class was marked. Right now Adrian and Isengard were having tea in a quiet environment. Suddenly Isengard put his teacup on the table and looked at Adrian. Ads by PubFuture. Tell me, my student, you got promoted, right? The redhead simply nodded to Isengard's question, surprising the man. But he's so young and he's already sequence 8, realizing that Isengard couldn't help but say that the current youth was just as capable. If Adrian told him that it had barely been 2 weeks since he became a Beyander, Isengard would have fainted. Keeping that inside him, he continued to chat with Isengard until he said goodbye and left. Adrian went back to his house and put on the same mask and cloak, and he headed back to the East Borough. Walking confidently through the streets, Adrian again caught sight of other Bloodmark members smoking in an alley off the main street. Smiling under his mask, Adrian approached them. The members of Blood Mark could not have had a more upset morning. The boss had called a large number of members and told them what happened in the bar last night. He warned them that they had to find the masked man and bring him back alive. They couldn't help but feel sorry for the poor bastard who dared to make the boss angry. They were interrupted by applause that came from the exit of the alley. The applause caused the crowd to part, allowing a person to be seen. A man by the physique, tall, masked, and covered by a cloak appeared, clapping exaggeratedly. Seeing their target in front of them caused surprise to engulf them, and they dropped their cigarettes in shock. "What's up, guys? Did the boogeyman get your tongue?" At those words, veins jumped on the faces of the group and they drew their knives, slowly approaching Adrian. "If you know what is good for you, you will come with us." Adrian rolled his eyes exaggeratedly at this threat, but because of the mask, they couldn't see him. The redhead just smiled under the mask, and raising his hand he just showed them the middle finger. This caused the guys' faces to turn red with anger and they jumped towards him. The redhead simply laughed out loud at this and charged towards them as well. The redhead came home at 2:30 a.m. and he was laughing softly. After walking around the East Borough all afternoon and Saturday night, the redhead was sure that the leader of Blood Mark would start looking for him with much more desire. This made him think again about what he did to all the gangsters who had the misfortune to run into him. Strip them naked, make them hug each other, tie them up like this with their own clothes, and send them like that to their boss. Laughing some more, Adrian was taking a cold shower, and while he insulted the nobles for being able to bathe with hot water, this made him think of something else. His pockets were practically dry of green. He had to find a way to get money, and lots of it. He didn't have any extraordinary artifacts of his own yet, and if he faced a Beander with one he would be at a disadvantage. Leaving that for later, Adrian fell asleep and decided to go in the morning to look for a job at Braveheart's bar, and if it didn't work well, the gangs would not only have to deal with their members being beaten up but also being robbed. Leaving that option as last, Adrian went to his bed to sleep. When Adrian woke up, he put on the mask and covered himself with the sack, preventing people from seeing his details other than he is quite tall. Arriving at the bar, maybe it was because it was Sunday morning but it was somewhat empty. The redhead simply went to the front and sat in front of the bar. The bartender gave him a strange look before Adrian asked to see the old man. The redhead made his voice deeper on purpose, taking advantage of the abilities brought by the potion. The bartender looked at him for a while longer before he said he was in a poker room in the back. Ads by PubFuture. Nodding to the bartender, Adrian restrained himself from provoking the bartender since Bravehearts would be his work area for some time. The old man was alone this time, although he was obviously surrounded by zombies protecting him. "What do you want, and talk fast, I don't have all day." The same reaction as when he first met him, and Adrian just chuckled. This made the old man pop a vein on his forehead. "If you don't have anything to ask me to get out." Deciding that it would be fun to mess with the old man, the redhead spoke. "Can't a grandson come to see his grandfather?" "What?" Obviously, the old man didn't expect that answer, so he reacted strongly. Laughing out loud, Adrian watched as the zombies began to rise, so he finally stopped, joking with the old man. With the two of them alone, the redhead finally took off his mask and allowed the old man to see his face. Seeing that face along with the red hair, the old man heaved a heavy sigh. When the zombies saw the redhead's smiling face, they simply sat back down and continued playing as if nothing had happened. The old man at this point gave up on the redhead and simply asked him what he wanted this time. "I want more jobs." At this, the old man sighed again. "I don't think you've forgotten the last job I gave you. Didn't that give you anything?" Ads by PubFuture. "I didn't win anything. You could say it was a scam, and a very annoying one." Listening to the redhead's tone, the old man decided not to poke his nose into the subject. The theme of jobs at Braveheart's bar was simply that they would post the job on the wall and ask nothing. If something happened between the boss and the one who accepted the job, they wouldn't ask or interfere, as long as it didn't affect the bar. He also remembered what he read in the newspaper, that 8 corpses were found in the middle of the street last week. So it's the same conditions as before. As long as they pay well, I won't have any problem with the jobs. Then go to the second floor and enter the first room on the right. That's where all the jobs they commission here are. Nodding to the old man, Adrian put the mask back on and left the room heading for the second floor. Going up to the second floor, the redhead entered through the door the old man said. The room was quite different from the others, this one was quite empty of chairs and there were only a few guards in the corners who stared at Adrian. He ignored this and went to the middle where a blond man was attending to some documents. Reason for visit. Commissioned works. The blonde simply took a green folder from his side and placed it in front of Adrian, keeping his attention on the documents. This reminded the redhead of an annoying secretary from his school, but he grabbed the folder and began to flip through the jobs. There were all kinds of jobs, from finding objects, people, and to even researching people. Adrian completely ignored finding things because he wasn't a seer to do all that process. But there was one that caught his attention and he was confident that he could finish it before the end of the day. A nearly bald and heavily bearded man was inside a bar inhaling heavily from a cigarette. These 2 days had been extremely stressful because a masked madman was walking around East Borough provoking and humiliating his men. And that extended to humiliating him, and that made him extremely furious. The rumors have already spread to the other gangs and they did not hesitate for a second to take advantage of the situation. In the morning, when more of his men were beaten and humiliated, members of a rival gang were seen in another area under his control. This was a violation of the treaty they made years ago, and this could trigger a war between them. Just thinking about it made him angrier, and he grabbed the glass of beer he was drinking and drank it all in one gulp. Before he could yell for a worker to bring him another one, someone stormed into the bar. It was one of his men, but he had undoubtedly run into the masked man. The poor man had a swollen face, he had black eyes and cracked lips. The man had some kind of strange garment covering his chest and crotch, it seemed to be made from the remains of his shirt and pants. The poor thing staggered to the boss and handed him a note before passing out and falling to the floor. One of his companions couldn't contain his laughter and laughed at the poor bastard in front of the boss. This caused him to receive a bottle on the head, causing it to break and his head hit the table, leaving him unconscious. Ordering his men to take the unfortunates away, he opened the note. In there was a somewhat crude drawing, but it could be easily understood, accompanied by a phrase in red letters. It was a big man drawn with 3 little hairs on his head and a thick beard that seemed to be sucking his finger while touching the hair on his head. Next to it was written, "Your feet have more hair than your head." The boss now only saw red, and he didn't care that he had to break the deal with the police not to rob with firearms, he was going to hunt down that masked bastard. Everyone with me now. Ads by PubFuture. He came out kicking the door of the bar, breaking it, and went to his base to collect weapons to hunt the bastard. The fact that he had dealings with the police never meant that he did not have weapons. All of this was seen by a figure on top of a roof. This figure was following the head of Blood Mark without him or his men noticing. He followed them for a while until they came to an old 3-story building on a pier. The chief entered along with his men without noticing the figure that followed them all the way. The figure was Adrian, who was with his mask and coat and looking at the building. The masked man looked at the building and managed to see an open window on the 3rd floor on the right side of it. Smiling under his mask, the redhead moved between the buildings, avoiding being seen until he made it to the right side of the Blood Mark's lair. From where he was standing, Adrian could clearly hear the boss's shouts and how the members moved around, and he could also smell the cigarette smoke coming from the open window. Shaking his head, the redhead began to use the old pipes of the building as a support to climb up to the window. With the bonus of the provoker potion, these moves weren't difficult for Adrian at all. Arriving at the window, Adrian poked his head in slightly and managed to see one of the gang members inside smoking in a corner. He seemed to be guarding a door. The guy had his back to Adrian, so taking advantage of that, the redhead quietly entered the building and slowly squatted down to the man. His footsteps were extremely silent, and thanks to the screams from below, the bastard didn't notice anything. Coming up behind him, Adrian reached up and lightly touched his shoulder. This caused the man to straighten up and drop the cigarette, and he quickly turned around with his back straight, lamenting that he would receive a reprimand. But the only thing he saw was a masked man in front of him, and he waved at him. Hey. Hey. Due to the surprise, the man returned the greeting, but then realized that this masked man was the one who had humiliated them these 2 days. Ads by PubFuture. But before he could yell for help or draw his knife, he received a powerful jab to the jaw which knocked him out immediately, but before he could hit the ground hard, Adrian stopped him and lowered him slowly. Shaking his head, the redhead searched the man's body and found some keys but nothing else. Disappointed, Adrian went to the door that the man guarded and before using the keys, he placed his ear against it. Not hearing anything, Adrian used the keys and unlocked the door before entering, grabbing the leg of the guy he had just knocked out and dragged him inside. Entering, Adrian re-locked the door and tied the man with his tripwire, and covered his mouth with his shirt. Leaving that aside, this should be the boss's office since it was the only one with a guard. Looking around the office, there was a desk along with several armchairs. Going to the desk, the redhead went through drawer by drawer. In the first drawer, there were various documents with information on the gangs in the areas and their territories. In the second, there were more documents, but they talked about the police officers they bribe and their information. In the third, there were £600, which made Adrian want to laugh out loud but held it back. But he also noticed something very strange. Why would the boss of a weak gang have so much money? His answer came when he opened the last drawer and found a small makeshift altar. In it were candles and a statue. This statue was that of a one-eyed giant hanging upside down on a cross. Adrian's pupils narrowed and his heartbeat seemed to stop, the temperature in the room seemed to have plummeted. I can't be so unlucky that just the gang I chose is a true creator believer. But Adrian didn't care about that right now, the only thing on his mind was to jump out the window and run. But before doing that, the worst that could happen happened. The statue's eye turned black along with the red pupil and began to cry something black, then that same eye moved and looked at the redhead. At that moment all thought left his head and his instincts took control and he ran to the window. But despite his great speed, he was still too slow. A mouth formed under the statue's eye and it opened. Adrian collapsed halfway down, blood pouring from every orifice on his face. The redhead put his hands over his ears as he began to scream. He wasn't the only one because the man he tied up was also writhing on the ground like crazy while blood fell from all the orifices on his face. Adrian's breathing became rough and his vision blurred, but he managed to see how the windows of the room were covered by shadows making his escape impossible. The true creator's ravings covered the entire room. It was a dark and crazy voice that seemed to speak all languages and contained a never-ending madness. Adrian even managed to recognize Portuguese, English, Spanish, and Russian among the ravings. The ravings also contain information that was about many things: rituals, elaboration of talismans, potions, acting methods, languages. Ads by PubFuture. Trying to do something, Adrian tried to use the same idea as Klein and use the Sephiroth as a shield against the ravings. Closing his bloody eyes, Adrian began to rapidly outline the sphere of light, but before he could complete it the ravings grew louder and contained even more information. This time it was about the hidden story, gods and starry sky. A shadow began to spread through Adrian's body that made him tremble, but he bit his lips hard until he drew blood and tried to outline the sphere of light again. Slowly the city of calamities began to appear and Adrian found himself inside, and the shadow that wrapped his body disappeared, being cleansed by the Sephiroth. The redhead was on his knees holding his head because the ravings transmitted too much information and he was using the healing ability of the City of Calamities to accommodate it. Blood kept dripping from the orifices on his face while his eyes slowly changed color. Outside things were not so good. The tied man who was with Adrian kept writhing and screaming as a shadow enveloped him. His skin began to split open, giving way to mouths with sharp teeth as his eyes exploded and a large red eye appeared in his forehead, but the man did not survive the transformation process and died while becoming a monster. The shadow of the room then began to extend to the exterior corridor, then to the stairs, and thus it continued to envelop the entire building, making escape impossible. The ravings of the true creator sounded throughout the entire building, causing all the people inside to change. All the members that were inside the building began to transform just like the man in the office, and just like him they couldn't stand the transformation. But something was happening in the lower part where the largest number of members were together. After a long while the ravings stopped and the statue's eye and mouth closed, causing the statue to break into pieces. After another while, the masked Adrian slowly got up. The redhead took out a revolver and pointed it at the statue, but seeing that it was broken, Adrian could only lower the gun. But then he looked at the transformed body of the man. This made him re-aim his revolver and shoot him in the head. Ads by PubFuture. As he was about to fire the second shot, Adrian realized that he was just a hideously mutated corpse and not a living monster. This made him sigh in relief, and when he took a better look at this hideous body, he found a disgusting resemblance to some monsters from Resident Evil. Thinking of Birkin from RE2, the redhead shook his head vigorously and, changing the bullet he had just fired for a new one, pointed to the door as he slowly approached the window. The shot and the ravings must have alerted everyone in the building, so why hadn't anyone come? When trying to get out of the building through the window, the only thing Adrian found was that it wouldn't open, and when he tried to break it, it didn't work either. After the fifth blow with all his might and seeing that the window showed no sign of giving way, Adrian looked towards the door. Unlocking the door with the keys, Adrian slowly opened the door and could see the empty hallway. Taking a breath, the redhead began to move slowly through the silent corridor. Adrian could no longer hear anyone in the whole building, he could only smell the same smell as in the office, and that was blood. The smell of blood was too strong. Holding the revolver tighter, Adrian went down to the second floor and found several bodies in the same condition as the one in the office. He tried using the second floor windows, but still, they all seemed sealed and impossible to break. Realizing that he would have to keep going down, the redhead simply cursed several times in his head. When he went down to the first floor, Adrian was very surprised that there was nobody, but he could still smell the blood and could see it covering a large part of it on the floor. Again, the windows didn't work. Seeing the stairs to the ground floor, Adrian moved incredibly slowly. The ground floor had the strongest smell of the blood of all the floors, and it was the darkest. Ads by PubFuture. When Adrian went down to the ground floor, he could see how there were only a few lamps on, causing the shadows to envelop a large part of it. From what little Adrian could see, it appeared to be a warehouse with some boxes along the sides. The floor was covered in blood and gore, but the same problem as before was happening that made Adrian's heart race. Where the fuck were the bodies? Suddenly a cold sweat broke out on his body and the redhead rolled forwards. In the place where he was, a huge thing came out of the shadows behind him and raised its huge arm and gave a powerful blow there, causing a crater to form. This thing looked like a disgusting fusion between many bodies. The thing was red and had no skin, which allowed Adrian to see the disgusting squirming muscles of this thing. It had mouths with sharp teeth all over its body, as well as huge red eyes looking everywhere. He had a huge right arm that seemed to be made from the fusion of two people, and his legs were very small compared to his body. It seemed to rise to 4.00 meters, and just because the ground floor was a warehouse, it could even stand up, but those legs could barely support its weight and seemed covered by shadows. Adrian was disgusted, as this thing looked like Birkin's stage 3.5 before it lost its human appearance. Cursing loudly, the redhead shot two of this thing's eyes, causing them to explode in black blood, and this thing let out a scream made up of different people's voices. Then this thing hid in the shadows again. The floor fell silent, and Adrian moved quickly to one of the lamps to avoid being surrounded by shadows. There were only 4 other lamps to illuminate this floor, but the situation meant that these were not enough. Ads by PubFuture. The same cold sweat ran down his back, and this time Adrian jumped to the left. From the shadow of one of the boxes, that thing jumped and pounced towards where he was. Adrian quickly shot another 2 eyes on the back of this thing. Giving another scream, the thing jumped into the shadows again and disappeared again. Before Adrian could brace himself, the thing came out of the shadows beside him and landed a blow on him, throwing him across the room and causing him to crash into multiple boxes. Adrian coughed up blood and felt that it was hard for him to breathe. It seemed that that thing broke a rib. Adrian then saw that he was covered in something clear and strong smelling. Alcohol. Opening his eyes, an idea came to his head, but before he could do anything else, the thing appeared again from the shadows and lowered its huge arm towards him. Barely managing to dodge, Adrian could see how the box was destroyed and the bottles that were inside were destroyed, making them cover the thing, but that seemed to care little for it. Hitting his last bullet in another eye, the thing hid in the shadows again. It seemed that several boxes were filled with bottles of alcohol. Having a better plan, Adrian quickly moved to one of the other boxes. Emptying his revolver, Adrian quickly reloaded it and waited for the bastard. He didn't have to wait long, as that thing reappeared and launched towards him. Adrian jumped hard to the right and the thing crashed into the alcohol box, being even more covered by this liquid. Adrian moved back to another box as he fired 3 shots at the thing. It followed him and hit using the long reach of its arm. Adrian dodged again and the thing broke another box again. Ads by PubFuture. The only reason Adrian could move like that was because the hunter pathway increased the body's resistance, and being sequence 8, the redhead could tolerate having a broken rib, but he couldn't go on like this all day. He only had 9 bullets left, including the ones in the revolver. The bullets he had didn't seem to do anything to it, so Adrian decided to go for a more classic option. He lunged for one of the lamps, but before he could reach it, the thing threw one of the boxes at him, forcing him to dodge. This box crashed into the lamp, causing it to break and ignite the alcohol on the floor. There were only 3 lamps left now. The fire spread very quickly. There was good news and bad news. The good news was that now that thing had less room to move in the shadows, but the bad news was that the fire wouldn't take long to cover the entire floor. Adrian was running out of time, and he had to find a way to kill that thing before it killed him. The thing tried to move into the shadows again, but due to the fire that lit up much of the warehouse, it seemed to take much longer to enter the shadows. Seeing the opportunity, the redhead took advantage of it and ran towards another of the lamps. As soon as Adrian managed to reach the lamp, the thing managed to enter the shadows. All this took 7 seconds. The fire was now engulfing the entire right wall of the warehouse, going up to the ceiling, making the warehouse look like a scene from hell because of all the blood in the place and how Adrian was holding the lamp in the middle of all this. There were still several shadows, but the thing didn't seem to want to come out. Adrian coughed a little and thought that what the thing was doing made a lot of sense. It might be a monster, but it was a monster born from the hanged man's ravings, so it would be afraid of fire. Now Adrian had to get it out. Unfortunately for the monster, whatever was keeping them locked up still worked because no windows were broken or affected, and it was also up against a crazy bastard with the ability to provoke beasts with no reason. In the middle of a burning warehouse, the figure of Adrian wrapped in a sack and mask took a breath. Then he looked at the few remaining shadows and began to speak to them. Hey, buddy, I know you're scared, but aren't you a little big to be a bit afraid of fire? The shadows started to vibrate, but it still wasn't enough to get the monster out of hiding. Seeing how the smoke began to envelop the entire floor and the fire became more intense, the redhead tried to think of how to best provoke the monster. When he felt that a light bulb went on in his head, he never found the boss's body, and it is assumed that he was here together with his men and they all hated him. Grinning hugely, Adrian bowed to the shadows that continued to vibrate. I'm sorry for causing you so much trouble, Chief of the Blood Mark, and I really apologize to your men. The shadow vibrations remained but were slightly weaker, but Adrian was never sorry. I imagine being the leader of a bunch of cowards was definitely a lot of stress that hit you pretty hard. Baldness was undoubtedly a great blow for you who were not yet 40 inches. The shadows began to vibrate more strongly than before, but it still wasn't enough, so Adrian let it all out. But maybe you should have let those 3 little hairs die, since you seriously look like a dirty egg and since your feet have more hair than your head. This finally made the monster come out of the shadows, screaming in a voice more like the boss's, but this one was darker and crazier. Adrian smiled at this and got ready with the lamp in hand when the monster rushed after him. The redhead threw the lamp at him at the same time that he pointed his revolver at it and shot. Less than 6 meters from each other, Adrian's bullet hit the lamp, causing it to explode, and the fire from it fell into the monster's body, igniting the alcohol. Ads by PubFuture. Moving out of the way, Adrian barely managed to dodge the fiery monster, but it used its arm to strike at him. Adrian barely managed to cross his arms to block, and the blow sent him back across the warehouse. His arms were now numb and he was having trouble holding the revolver. The monster was now screaming with the voices of all the gangsters, and the boss's voice was lost among them. Sliding across the floor, Adrian had to roll to avoid the crazy blows from the monster that was now in a frenzy. Getting up quickly, the redhead tried to shoot the monster's legs, but it used its arms to block them. The monster seemed to be unable to enter the shadows anymore, and it simply went into a frenzy to kill him. Adrian spent his time jumping and moving between the boxes to avoid the monster, while it had no problem smashing them to get to him. This caused more alcohol to feed the fire, engulfing the monster, and bottles that were saved started rolling across the floor. The redhead, every time he dodged, took the opportunity to grab one of the bottles and throw them towards the monster, causing them to explode, covering him. This went on for 5 minutes, and now most of the warehouse was on fire and Adrian was covered in sweat and very agitated. It became more and more difficult to breathe due to the smoke, and it was more difficult for him to move. Luckily, the monster was worse since now he could barely move and the fire had consumed a large part of his body. Adrian used 2 bullets to shoot it in the legs and make the monster finally only able to crawl and use its arm to attack. Adrian only had 4 bullets left now and the monster finally seemed to run out of energy. Suddenly the fire consumed a decent part of the roof, causing this part to collapse and blocking the stairs. Time was running out and if the air didn't run out before then the building would fall on them. So Adrian used his last bullets while continuing to throw the bottles towards the monster. Ads by PubFuture. Finally, the monster gave a great scream and its physical form collapsed, leaving it alone as a huge pile of burning meat. The sound of breaking glass rang throughout the building like a window breaking, but Adrian knew that it was what was keeping him locked up and had finally stopped working. Before he could run to the door he managed to see how a burned black band left the monster. An extraordinary object. Adrian only thought for 3 seconds and decided to grab the band and left the building through the door. Just when he came out the building completely collapsed. Adrian was coughing hard as he took in big breaths of fresh air, he was covered in sweat and very tired. As he started to leave, Adrian managed to see a group of 4 people in front of him. Shit. The crimson moon began to ascend while the sky was turning black. You are detained by the Church of the Lord of the Storm, so surrender or you will suffer the consequences. The strong and deep voice of the leader echoed through the street while behind Adrian the building burned. Now Adrian might be a member of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, but he strongly doubted that the punishers before him would believe him. After all, he was still in a training period and had no way to verify his identity. So, looking at the options, Adrian saw the black band on his hand and gnashing his teeth, he quickly placed it on his left arm and put spirituality to it. Suddenly Adrian felt that the shadows were in his control as the ravings of the true creator sounded in his ears. But these are weak. These cannot be compared to those ravings in the office, thought Adrian while screaming in his head. So Adrian added more spirituality and he felt one with the shadows and quickly allowed himself to be embraced by them. The punishers were not going to let this masked man do what he wanted and they shot him. But Adrian had already disappeared into the darkness protected by the shadows.